right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. We are on chapter 4. This is part 1. So you know the routine, get all your stuff out and ready to go. Pause me if you need to, and then otherwise we will get going. Let me get a drink right quick. Okay, so let me see, chapter 4, Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for Empire to 1763 is where we're at. So the way this chapter is really divided up, the first half, so this whole lecture, just a heads up from the top, this whole lecture is just about slavery and the establishment of American slavery as an institution, okay? So just keep that in mind as we're moving forward. Okay, so hopefully you guys are ready to go. This is a map that I added a while back, and looking at it, I can't remember exactly what it was that drew me to it. I guess this is just, anyway, I'll quit speculating and get on with it. If you guys find a date on here and you can let me know, maybe that will jog my memory. I guess it's just the Middle British colonies, which is why I guess I chose it, because that's where, okay, this is all coming back to me. So we have been talking about the Chesapeake and the tobacco and sugar industries, well, sugar in the South, but tobacco really in the Chesapeake, which is where this map is. So probably should have figured that out before I started recording this. I apologize. Any ol' who. Okay, so this is a map of the middle colonies. So really, you know, from the lower end of this and further south is where slavery will thrive, so to speak. Okay, so here we go. Our first slide is slavery and empire. All right, so between 1492 and 1820, approximately 10 million enslaved Africans were sent from Africa to North America. Okay, 10 million people. It's estimated that about 50%, so 5 million of our 10 million, were sent to North America during the 1700s, okay? So 1700 to 1800, half of all people who would be enslaved and sent to North America come during that time. So we talked about this last time, or a couple lectures back, but whenever there is the first Dutch ship that arrives in 1619, okay, so that was the beginning of slavery in British North America, okay? Okay, and before I get started, I'm just gonna cue my book up real quick because I know that there are things to look at. Okay, so if you guys have your book in front of you, 6th edition, it's page 107. 5th edition should be 5 pages before or after that-ish. I can't remember. But I want you guys to look at the Atlantic trading routes. So this shows different trade that is going about between Africa, Europe, North America. Okay, this network is known as the Atlantic, or this is the trading route. This is commercial goods and also human trafficking, okay? So please know that I am differentiating between the two. And there's another map that we'll look at in just a second, so keep that there. Actually, go ahead and flip that. Okay, so this is the Atlantic slave trade, all right? So the goods in the previous map that are going back and forth, so we have, our crops up north, lumber, fur, all of those types of things, and then in the south, this is directly related to slave trade, okay? So going to the next page, 108, if you're in the 6th edition. So the Atlantic slave trade is a crime against humanity. It is, and I think I probably mentioned this in a previous video, but depending on where you go to school, depending on what your state's requirements are, there are some books that don't even bring up the slave trade at all. They don't even mention it as a concept. So it is important to talk about, and it is important to acknowledge that this was a crime against humanity. Okay, there. This network was made up of European merchants, African traders, and American planters who all partook in the bargaining over human lives as a way to secure a profit. You can go back to the map that has all of the different goods that are being exported from North America, but we know that the main crops that are being focused on are sugar, rice, coffee, and tobacco. All right. And because of the interest in those goods, there is a rising demand in them, which then leads our planters to begin becoming more involved in the slave trade. So increasing their operations and doing this with enslaved people. Okay, so in the 1700s, the Caribbean was still the main commercial focus of the Western Hemisphere. Stuff's not really popping off in the British northern colonies yet. So sugar in the Caribbean. Okay, so the British sent manufactured goods to Africa and the colonies. Colonial products were sent to Europe, and then slaves were sent from Africa to the New World, and also Europe in some instances. We're just talking about North America right now. Okay, and then there's the rise of our first port cities. So New York, Charleston, Savannah, and then in the Caribbean. But this is all around trade, and the slave trade is part of that, okay? Okay, so let's look at this next slide. So merchants in New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, so up north. It's important to know that they were also participating in the slave trade, okay? Like I said, you can look at this map and see that all of these things, it's all interconnected, okay? So while they might not have slaves on plantations in the South, in the North, they're still buying and selling and trading goods that are reliant on slave labor, okay? So this is happening in the North also, okay? Okay, slave economies of the West Indies, so the Caribbean, were the largest market, or had the largest market for fish, grain, livestock, and lumber that was exported from New England this time, and the middle colonies. Okay, Liverpool and Bristol, like I said, port cities start to arise because of these industries that are being developed. There's also banking, shipbuilding, insurance. Those all become industries during this time, and this will eventually lead to the beginning of the early Industrial Revolution, which we'll talk about later on, okay? And then at the bottom of the slide, I have that first map that we looked at. So that's what that's about. Okay, so moving forward, England and Scotland, almost forgot what that place was called. So they joined together and become Great Britain in 1707. And by this point, the colonies already were more diverse with immigration, people coming in from different areas. But they were still very integrated into the British Empire, all right? Yeah, we'll talk about that more whenever we get to the American Revolution. And even as the war's breaking out, people consider themselves British. Okay, so the idea of being American doesn't exist yet. All right. Okay, so there is within the colonies, there's a simultaneous expansion of freedom and slavery. This meant liberty for free Englishmen. Okay, so freedom for some. And this was also the height of the Atlantic slave trade, right? The center of it was in the Chesapeake, like I said at the beginning, okay? All right, so most African societies participated in the slave trade, and this had to do with European powers going over, and Africans who became involved in the slave trade were able to kind of play off of European powers, play them off of one another, and then also collect taxes and revenue from foreign merchants. And so they believed that this was a way of keeping the capture and the sale of slaves under their control. And at this, well, it would remain this way, but so few Europeans who went to Africa to capture enslaved people and take them elsewhere, Europeans would mostly stay on the coast. They didn't really go inland. And so this was where our African mercenaries, that's what their job was. They would be the ones to go inland, get people, march them out to the coast where they would be picked up by Europeans. Okay. So slavery, and this mostly takes place in Western Africa. Okay, so, and I'll get to a map here in just a second, but so the slave trade becomes more central to West African society. It was a source of wealth for African merchants and, of power for newly emerging African kingdoms. This also accounted for the loss of tens of thousands of lives, livelihoods of men and women to slavery. And this weakened and distorted West Africa's society and economy, which could be argued, even today, they're still dealing with repercussions from that. Okay, so the voyage from Africa to the colonies becomes known as the Middle Passage. So this is actually the first Middle Passage. Later on in our history, we will see the second Middle Passage. But for now, this is the first Middle Passage. Okay. Okay. Like I said, there is a map, and the reason I wanted to put up this map, let me see. Okay, I'm sure that fact is in here somewhere. But I want you guys to look at this map. Pause me, take as much time as you need, but this, and zoom in because you can tell, I think this came from National Geographic, if I remember correctly. But anyway, but this is to show different cultural groups in Africa. So this is based on language. This is to show you how many different cultural groups were there at this time. And the reason I like to look at this is to also compare this to the map that we looked at of the Western Hemisphere, so North and South America, and even the map we looked at of just North America, to show all of these different cultures that were going on, that's not the picture that is presented to us whenever we learn these histories. So I want you guys to look at this map and just realize that how diverse Africa was and is now, but this is super important because there is a misconception. It's a Eurocentric misconception that, all indigenous Americans were nomadic peoples who lived in teepees, which we know that those are the Plains peoples, but there are misconceptions about stereotyping and lumping people all in together. So I want you guys to look at this map to see, to smash that idea, all right? Okay. So moving on. Okay, so we're starting with measles on this next slide. Alrighty. So as with, where the Europeans go, disease goes too. So measles and smallpox spread rapidly across the Middle Passage, and especially thinking about being in, small areas like ships, disease spreads very quickly. Think about it from a 2020 perspective. Look at all of the cruise ships that so quickly spread COVID amongst their passengers. So think about just being isolated and at sea and how quickly things can develop, okay? So measles and smallpox spread rapidly, and 1 in 5 people who made that journey across the Middle Passage died. Disease, people were murdered, sick people were thrown overboard. So it's just it's terrible. So like I said, 1 in 5, so it's about 20% of all people who made that passage did not survive. And then here I have, it just says 108, 109, but those are page numbers, sorry. But so if you still have your book open and you're looking at 108, I want you to look at 109. This is an image of a slave ship, and you can see, this is the different levels broken down, but so you can see in the center, that middle, the middle deck, this is where enslaved Africans were kept, held, shackled together, laying down so that they could get people in bunks. But that is the reality of the Middle Passage. So I would like for you guys to look at that image, just so you can see this, this depiction, that drawing. Okay, so less than 5% of slaves who were carried to, transported, is how I would actually put that, to the New World were destined for the mainland. Most people are still going to the Caribbean at this point, working on sugar plantations, okay? And also Brazil. And at this point, the death rates on these plantations was still incredibly, incredibly high. And it led to this, quote, demand to constantly repopulate their slave populations that were being decimated. So that in itself, what am I trying to say? That in itself really solidifies slavery during this time, okay? All right, so within what's the present day United States, there were approximately 400,000, between 400,000 and 600,000 enslaved Africans brought here during the colonial period. By 1770, so right before the American Revolution, about 460,000 of the 2.3 million people who were in the colonies, excluding first Americans, but that 460,000 people were of African descent. All right. Okay, so let's talk about the Chesapeake. Oops. All right, so tobacco. Like I said, this is a staple crop. In the south, it's sugar. Up north, we have tobacco. Again, going back to Pocahontas, her husband, John Rolfe, introduced the strain of tobacco that really thrives here. So it's the oldest and largest staple crop of the Chesapeake. And looking at population numbers by 1770, so again, right before the American Revolution, the slave population there made up 50% of the total population, all right? And half of European families owned at least one slave. Okay, and then Virginia revoked the right for free Africans to have European servants, also the right to bear arms, any voting rights, and any property owning rights as well. They also required that free slaves be sent from the colony, and that kind of marks this trend of limiting any rights that might have been there to begin with, okay? Especially legal and voting in regards to that. Okay, so South Carolina and Georgia. All right, so like I said, tobacco is a huge thing. Looking further south, kind of before we get into the sugar region. But so rice and indigo. And indigo is a dye. That's what it originally was used to dye denim, okay? The way these fields are cultivated, they need not that they need, but they had larger plantations. And the larger the plantation, the more slaves these plantation owners felt like they needed. So that just keeps reinforcing the institution of slavery in itself, okay? Okay, so kind of at this point in time, in some areas it depends where you are and who you were talking to, but some plantations had what was known as the task system, where basically slaves were given daily tasks, and whenever they finished those, then they could go home for the day, tend to their own farms, be with their families, okay? And that, it allowed for some leisure to a certain extent. But that model, like I said, it depends on who you're talking to and kind of where you go, but that we'll see that go away over time. Okay. So looking up north, New England and the Middle Colonies, they were non-plantation based. Even at this point in history, North and South, their industries are really establishing themselves, okay? Plantations in the South, merchants in the North that will then industrialize and have factories and all of that stuff. But so you can see these divisions happening. Okay, New England, Middle Colonies, like I said, non-plantation. They used farmhands whenever families couldn't do the work based on their own family members. Remember I said our Yemen class was really reliant on using their own children. That's why they would have larger families usually, okay? Which is, anyway, I was going to say it's contradictory from what we know now, because larger families, that's more mouths to feed, but anyway. Okay, so in the North, people were more reliant on farmhands to helping supplement any needed labor, and then the merchant system will develop. So like I said, that's what we'll get into the Industrial Revolution eventually, okay? But so, slavery does exist. Is there a number that I have here? Yeah, we'll get to population percentages here in just a sec, but smaller than in other regions. So where families that do have slaves, going back to the farmhand like I was talking about, so it would be farmhand work, stevedores, who were dock workers, or personal servants also. So this was, man, I feel like I'm just doing a bad job of explaining this. I apologize. So in the North, these positions I'm talking about, this could either be free persons working or enslaved people, okay? So I feel like I started out saying one thing and went to the other. This is representative of slave labor and non-slave labor, okay? So there is a lower slave population, like I said. Because there's a lower slave population, laws against people of color were less harsh because this was considered to be less of a threat for Europeans. Marriages for people of color were legally recognized in our northern colonies, and they could also sue, testify in court, own property, and pass it on to their children. Okay, so homes in the North that did have slaves would often have 1 to 2 slaves as domestic labor. And like I said, so this is a smaller population number-wise, but still a slave population nonetheless, okay? So I'm not trying to paint it in a more positive light. But yes, smaller than the South is what we'll say, okay? So 3% compared to when we're looking at the Chesapeake, which has a 50%, right? So significantly smaller, all right? So yeah, slave labor is less central to the economy than in southern colonies. Okay, but yeah, so like I said, that 3%, it's small, but it's still a slave population nonetheless. So that 3% that represents 500,000 people. Okay, so that's why I'm like, it's still significant in itself. Okay. Our middle colonies, New York and New Jersey, their slave population was about 10%, so you can just see it increasing further south. So slavery stagnated in Philadelphia after 1750 because of the rise of artisans and merchants who relied on wage laborers, and they would have apprentices, I was like interns, apprentices who they would, pay and teach this craft to, and so this was more of the system. Okay, yes, and then there is an indentured servant population in the north as well. Okay. So, becoming African American. I put this in quotes because it doesn't seem... Who's a history book, or who's a historian or a history book to tell anyone about their identity is how I view it. But anyway, okay. So, for most of the 1700s, North American slaves were African by birth, all right? They were not one unified or united culture, which goes back to that map a few slides back. By the 1800s, many identified not by their African tribal names, but by slave names, okay? All right, so the slave culture that develops over time in North America, this culture was based on the bond not of kinship, language, or ethnicity, but like I said, this is a slave culture. It all comes down to the sharing of the experience of enslavement. Okay. So over these next few generations, this will create a cohesive culture of synthesis of various traditions. So there will be African tradition, European tradition, and then new American traditions. And like I said, so that will develop over generations. So we'll see that more as we go. Religion was very heavily based on West African practices. Like I said, most of this was coming out of West Africa. So that it had elements of Islam and then Christianity. So that goes back to these different connections tying in. Okay, and many Europeans viewed traditional African religions as witchcraft. That can be directly related to the Salem witch trials because it was initially blamed on Tituba, who was an African slave from the Bahamas, who was accused of doing voodoo, as it's referred to as. But so you can see that right there, okay? Okay, so by 1740, the slave population began to reproduce and numbers began increasing that way. Okay, so in the Chesapeake, there were fewer plantations than in the Deep South, more Yemen farmers, so our poorer European families. And then there was also more of a balanced exposure to European culture. Okay, and there, people picked up English very quickly and then adopted Christianity, right? So that's the Chesapeake. South Carolina and Georgia, so think our rice and indigo plantations. There are harsher conditions, okay, so just harsher conditions the further south you go. Low birth rates made the industry dependent on, this goes back to what I was saying a little while ago, this continued importation of slave labor from Africa. So there's less European contact in South Carolina and Georgia, so people pick up English slower than in the Chesapeake. And there, also African-style houses were built in South Carolina and Georgia that kind of continued this traditional culture of housing. Okay, so we have African-style houses, African names, and then people spoke Gullah, which was different. It had different African roots that created a new language. Okay. All right. So, sorry. Okay, so any slaves that were in cities like Charleston or Savannah were more likely to just become assimilated into urban culture, all right? And then looking back north once more, so in New England, slaves were dispersed in smaller numbers. Like I said, we were looking at that 3% population as compared to the 50% in the South. But so we have smaller populations, and there is a distinct culture that developed slower. So more of an exposure to European culture, actually, okay? Also in the North, there is more mobility and then access to freer lifestyles. As I said, our slave population wasn't considered as much of a threat, and I quote, to the European population in the North. So people were allowed to go about and be more mobile than in the South, per se. Okay. So lastly for this section for today, okay, resistance. Okay, the first recorded slave uprising of the 18th century, okay, so not the 17th century, but the 18th century, was in 1712. This occurred in New York City. And during the slave revolt, buildings were burned on the outskirts of town, and 9 Europeans were killed. So that's 1712. There is a rebellion in 1731 in Louisiana, which temporarily halted any efforts to introduce the plantation system there. And then there's the Stoner Rebellion in 1739, so this is in South Carolina. So slaves who had recently arrived from Congo, some of whom had been soldiers before being sent to South Carolina. This group of individuals, they seized weapons. They seized a store or a magazine of weapons, and they marched south, burning homes and barns. And during that, 12 Europeans were killed. But it's mostly important to note that 12 Europeans were killed, but as a result of that, the retaliation and violence that was experienced, 200 African Americans died after the Stoner Rebellion. Okay, so that is just to show that this institution, whenever we get to, I guess it's chapter 14 in the South, slavery was referred to as the peculiar institution, which is just a way of, that's just a nice label for it. Oh, how peculiar this institution is, but no. Anyway, so yeah, I feel like this lecture always, at the end of it, I just feel like I don't really know what to say because we have a lot to go through still, and this is, like I said, really just the establishment of this whole system. So, yeah, well, so the next half of this chapter pretty much completely changes tone and starts to look at patriotism amongst European colonists and organization leading up to the American Revolution. So, okay, well, I'm going to leave it there for today. If you guys have any questions about anything, feel free to give me a shout. and I will get this uploaded, and then I will do the second half of this, not today, but tomorrow, and get it uploaded for you guys. So keep doing what you're doing. You guys are doing awesome. Yeah, let me know if you need anything, and I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.